For the last 7 years, McKinsey Company, in partnership with leanin.org, have conducted a national study about the progress women have made in the workforce. And more than 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, their latest report found that women in corporate America are more burned out than ever before. However, despite this fact, women are supporting their employees and rising to meet the challenge of diversity, equity, and inclusion at work. However, their efforts are not being recognized at the same rate as their male counterparts. Furthering this discussion is the fact that the report found for every 100 men promoted to a position of leadership or manager, only 86 women are promoted to the same position of leadership, leaving a sizable gap that we must close. Kim Meninger is an executive coach and women's leadership consultant and the founder of Executive Career Success, whose mission is to assist women leaders at all levels to confront the challenges which are holding them back from maximizing their overall leadership potential and career success. Meninger joined me this week to have a conversation about women's equity in the workforce and how we increase their ability to assume leadership positions and positions of power. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. So Kim, if you're ready, I'll take a few minutes to welcome you to the program, and I'm excited to talk to you all about women in the workplace. Great to see you this morning, and thank you so very much for being here.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you today.
As am I. Now, Kim, I know that you're very passionate about your day job, helping women gain a better sense of empowerment in male-dominated fields. So I'm wondering if you can tell me all about the great work that you do.
Sure. Thank you for asking. So I actually worked in a high-tech organization for much of my career before I transitioned into coaching and consulting. And it was there that I learned a lot about the differences in experiences between men and women. And, you know, I'm not saying that it was all bad by any means. I certainly had some very positive experiences during that time, but I had an opportunity to see that, you know, we are experiencing things differently, and there are different strategies that I think can work better for women in these kinds of environments. And so I've been spending the last 10 years or so really focusing on helping women to build their confidence. So if they feel like things, you know, they're in a system that doesn't necessarily work for them, that it's not about them, that there are potentially issues with the fit and how to manage imposter syndrome. I talk about ensuring that you're getting visibility for all the great work that you're doing, because oftentimes women are less comfortable with self-promotion and maybe doing a lot of really good invisible work that doesn't get recognized. And also, you know, building influence through strategic relationships. So making sure that you're not just focusing on great friendships, but also building important relationships across the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Kim, as we emerge from the pandemic, women are taking on a more sense of leadership as in terms of positions of power. You know, they're supporting teams at a higher rate, and they're really asserting themselves despite the challenges of the pandemic. So I'm wondering your thoughts on the emergence of women in leadership as we emerge from the pandemic. I'm curious.
Yes, and it's really interesting to look at some of the research that's been done throughout the pandemic around the results of women-led organizations or even women-led countries. It's really, I think, demonstrating that some of the leadership traits that we have traditionally associated with women are rising to the top right now. Things like empathy, things like collaboration and listening. And so it's not to suggest that women or men are better than the other. It's more so that some of the traits that we have not prioritized in leadership are really starting to take a bigger spotlight. And I think we all have an opportunity to think about how we can take the lessons learned from the pandemic and shift our own styles and really put the human, the employee at the center. For so long, organizations have prioritized profits at the expense of the well-being of their teams and of their human resources. And I think what we have an opportunity to think about right now is that when we take care of our people, they perform at a higher level. It's not just a service to them, it's a service to our business. So it's to our advantage to think about, how do we invest in leaders who care? How do we invest in leaders who are empathetic to the needs of their employees? Because everybody wins when we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about human capital, Kim. For myself, part of my professional background is helping individuals with physical disabilities find and maintain employment. And I have cerebral palsy myself, so it's a personal passion project of mine. So I'm curious to ask you about diversity, equity, and inclusion for women, and how we sort of close that gap for women in general and women with disabilities as well.
Yeah, and it's such a great question. And it really is baffling to me that we are not further along in this process, given how definitive the research has been about the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion to business, not just to people. And so one of the things that I think about a lot is that often the efforts, the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts fall on younger, earlier career employees who are doing volunteer work with their employee resource group or their affinity group. This is outside of their full-time job. They're not getting compensated in any additional way for this work. It might even prevent them from taking on higher profile projects that advantage their male counterparts. And yet they do this work because they're very mission driven and they believe in the values that they're supporting. But unfortunately, the organization isn't prioritizing this work. So there may be an executive sponsor, there may be some PR around it. But if organizations truly are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, they would prioritize it in the same way that they prioritize any other business initiative. They would see it as a strategic opportunity. They would give it appropriate resources, financially and otherwise, and they would solve it like a regular business problem. And so I feel like there's a lot of opportunity there to move this in a more impactful direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Kim, let's talk for a moment about racial equity. As far as we have come, racial equity is still a problem for women of color and other minority groups. So I'm curious about your thoughts on how we close the gap in terms of giving women equal opportunities if they're women of color or other minority groups as well.
Yeah, and it's such a great question. And I think sometimes we fall back on the expectation that the system is going to change, that, we're waiting for the organization to be more inclusive or to be more diverse. And then that disempowers us as individuals. So each one of us You know, no matter what position you hold within the organization, we hold that value around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have an opportunity to show up as allies for women of color in particular, given your question, right? And to ask ourselves, you know, as a white woman, I have had certain challenges navigating gender dynamics in the workplace. I know that it is much more complicated for women of color. And so I have an opportunity when, you know, when perhaps I'm invited to sit on a panel or invited to be part of a conversation, to use my influence to say, hey, we don't have enough representation of other groups in this room. Let's include so-and-so, or, you know, maybe to offer a speaking opportunity to one of my friends who's a woman of colors, things like that, that we can do independent of a larger strategy. And so I think it's something for us to consciously reflect on and pay attention to in our workplaces, is where might we drive greater equity and inclusion, and not just wait for other people to figure that out.
It's always better to lead by example, isn't it?
Exactly. And then hopefully what that does is it creates a more contagious effect. I mean, I will say, having worked in this space of, you know, gender bias and racial bias for a long time, I do believe that for the most part, people have good intentions and are not making decisions with nefarious intent, right? I do think that it's largely, we don't know what we don't know. We have blind spots because if it's not our experience, we're not paying attention to it. And the more that we all make a conscious effort to pay attention to the experiences of each other and support one another, I think we can mobilize in a way that will hopefully accelerate the pace of change, even while we wait for more of the systemic changes to happen at higher levels.
Yeah, you talk about change, Kim, and more women are becoming the breadwinners of the family on top of being nurturing mothers, whether they're a single parent or they're married. They're increasingly becoming head of the household. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that trend of women sort of taking over the dominant role of being the breadwinner and the financial support of the family. What are your thoughts there?
I think it's a really interesting dynamic. And, you know, like you said, there's a number of factors at play. I am extremely fortunate in that I have a husband who is very much a partner in the domestic responsibilities that we have together. We have 2 young children. We share very equally the responsibilities of caring for our children, caring for our home. And we talk through that. We are, you know, deliberate about how we distribute those responsibilities. Not everyone has that option. You know, certainly if you're a single parent, or, you know, some couples don't have that kind of relationship. But I do think that it's worth thinking about our own empowerment, right? To ask for what we need, and not to assume that we need to take on the full burden of everything that's happening around us. That's one of the traps that women often fall into, is this super woman profile of, well, I have to do this myself and I have to do all, you know, X, Y, and Z. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to take care of our own needs. We can actually be more effective. We can be of greater service to others if we prioritize our own needs first. Because if I give everything away to everybody else and I don't take care of myself, I have nothing left to give, right? So.
Yeah, that goes to burnout too, Kim. I'm curious to ask you how much work you do with your clients to make sure that they're not burned down in terms of their professional energy, and which they can also give to their personal life. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on effective ways to manage burnout.
Yeah, and it's such a good question right now in particular, because burnout is on the rise as a result of the pandemic. Working from home has blurred a lot of the lines between home and work. So a lot of people are feeling like they're working all the time now. and they don't get any kind of a break. And so it's very important. And I have been working a lot with my clients around managing burnout. I think one of the most powerful strategies for managing burnout is setting boundaries. And that's not easy to do, especially for people who are people pleasers by nature, or who are afraid that if they set a boundary, that there's going to be some backlash to that. But I think it all starts with what we teach other people about what we're willing to tolerate. And so if I am up all night sending emails, people are going to expect that it's okay to send me emails and that I will respond at midnight or 1 a.m, right? But if I set that boundary and I say, unless it's an emergency, don't expect a response from me after 6 p.m., then people become accustomed to that. And, if it doesn't work, right, then maybe I need to consider whether or not this is the best opportunity for me. But I think we all have an opportunity to really think about where we're saying yes to things that aren't serving us. They aren't advancing our goals. They're not in alignment with our values. We get stuck in very low value kinds of activities, especially some of the caretaking things that we've been talking about, right? Women have felt a greater responsibility to care for their coworkers, which can be exhausting. We take on other people's energy and then we don't have, again, space for our own. So setting those boundaries is a really important part of managing our own mental health.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I used to work as the job developer at the YMCA here in Winterton, and my boss's desk was directly across from mine, and she had always had to tell me that just because you receive emails in your inbox doesn't mean you automatically have to answer them as soon as they come in your inbox. And I had to train myself not to answer emails after 4:30. So I can agree with that, and I'm still trying to work on it. It's a work in progress, isn't it?
It is. You're absolutely right. But that's a good manager to say that too. And I think that's another opportunity for us to support each other, because I think everyone's afraid to be the first one to set that boundary, but everybody wants it. And if one brave soul speaks up and says, hey, why don't we decide collectively that we're not going to work after a certain period of time, then we all benefit from that.
Yeah, it goes back to work-life balance, doesn't it?
It does. You're right.
Sometimes those lines are blurred, Kim. I know. And I know, Kim, that you primarily work with your clients on what you call imposter syndrome, which is the epidemic across workplaces, especially the lack of psychological safety. So I'm wondering if we can dive into that this morning.
Yes. So imposter syndrome is that sense that despite the fact that I'm doing well and people think that I'm performing at a high level, I feel like a fraud. I feel like it's only a matter of time before people figure out that I don't actually know what I'm doing, or that I don't actually belong in the role that I have. And that is something that is a fairly universal experience. Statistics show that somewhere between 70 and 80% of the population will experience this at one time or another. The challenge is that when we feel this way, we carry it around like a deep, dark secret. We don't feel comfortable saying it out loud. And so we think we're the only ones. And that can have a compounding effect, because if I'm already feeling like I'm not prepared for my role, or I'm on the cusp of failure, and I'm not willing to share that, I'm denying myself access to resources and support that could help me through that. And so it's a very isolating experience. It's very anxiety provoking, and it has all kinds of peripheral effects on our physical well-being, on our mental well-being, and on our career growth more broadly. We tend not to want to be in the spotlight when we feel this way. And so we might deprive ourselves of opportunities to nurture relationships with mentors or sponsors who can help us to grow. We might not raise our hand for a challenge or a new opportunity because we think we're not ready for it. And so this has a lot of effects on us. And what's interesting about it is that it tends to strike during times of transition. So it tends to be most active when we are stepping outside of our comfort zone into something new that's unfamiliar to us. And we have this very strong sense of what we don't know. And that makes us feel less than in many ways. And because the pandemic has brought so much uncertainty and so much change so quickly, it has driven up the rates of imposter syndrome. So you're seeing more people asking the question of, am I doing this right? Is there, is everybody else figured this out and I haven't, right? So there's a lot of self-doubt.
Yeah, and you work with women to sort of, as you said earlier, become more visible and more confident within the workplace, and they're not the problem, right? And they're not always the thing that needs to be fixed. So I'm curious to ask you about how do we make sure that women are more visible and prominent in not only positions of leadership, but the workplace in general?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And so I think about when you talk about this concept of women not needing to be fixed, that's really important to the work that I do, because there are often development programs or women's initiatives that tend to essentially transfer the problem to women. So as long, if we fix women, if only women were more confident, if only women behaved in these different ways, then the problem would go away. When in actuality, the problem is the system. The system still has a lot of built-in biases that favor men. And so it's important to me to do this work because at the end of the day, whatever's driving the pain is very real. So whether my imposter syndrome comes from my own internal beliefs or it comes from the environmental factors around me, I need to manage that more effectively in order to operate at a higher level, in order to have a better life experience. And so one of the ways in which I help women is to give them those tools, but in context, to let them know it makes perfect sense that you feel this way because of the way your system is set up, because you lack psychological safety in these spaces, because there is less inclusion. And so rather than having us internalize the problem as something wrong with us, we recognize the larger issue and can process that as part of the solutions that we put into place. And so one of the things that I think is really important is that we as women don't try to simply show up in more masculine ways. It doesn't work for us. It's not authentic, and it doesn't work for anybody because there's typically backlash to that. So for women to be more visible and influential, the way I generally recommend it is to lean into being of service. It's expected that women want to help others. It's expected that women are collaborative and supportive of others. So if we look at what we're doing in the context of how can this be even more impactful to the business? How can I help my colleagues by bringing what I uniquely have strengths in to the table? Then I get the benefit of that greater influence and visibility. I can do it in a way that feels right to me, and I can make a bigger impact with less backlash.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about representation in your last answer, and I'm going to go back to inclusion of women with disabilities just for a second, because I'm curious to ask you about if you had a platform of employers to encourage them to hire individuals with disabilities, specifically women, because I think, women have a different way of looking at the workplace than men do. But when it comes to people with disabilities, I don't have to tell you that the unemployment rates are higher. So how do you think we develop sort of a roadmap to hire more women with disabilities? And what would be your message to employers who are looking to diversify their workforce?
I think it's such an important point. And I think about this in a couple of ways. I have personally worked with a number of women who have invisible disabilities and have been reluctant to share that as part of their interview process or with their managers because they're afraid that they will be penalized for that in some way. And so there's not just the burden of having a disability, but of also, again, hiding it from others. And there are very reasonable accommodations that can be made to somebody who has a disability to allow them to perform at their best, that if we aren't willing to share that information with our leadership, we are denied access to that. And so it puts us in a position where we're not getting the full support that we need in order to do our best work. And so part of it, I think, is really giving managers in particular more information about how people who have different types of disabilities actually have really great complementary strengths to people who don't have those same disabilities. And so I think sometimes we come at it from the perspective of what do we lose, right? We have to make accommodations. We don't have access to the same type of resource that we might have in somebody who has different capabilities. But what do we lose by not having more people with disabilities in our organization, right? We lose access to people with very different perspectives and skills and strengths. And so the more that we as managers understand the benefits, and this is true of all inclusion, right? The more that we understand the benefits of diversity, the more that we can proactively incorporate people of different capabilities, different backgrounds into our workforce. And so I think a lot of what happens is comes from a place of lack of information and fear that I don't know how to manage somebody who has different capabilities than I do, or what if I get it wrong, or I don't know enough about this. But that's all within our power to rectify. We can take that on. We can educate ourselves. We can do more to engage with people who are different from us. And I think that's an important part of the important role that we all have to play if we are ever going to realize the full vision of inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. Kira, I'm curious about how you would complete this sentence. How do you think full advancement of women in the workplace will be achieved where we no longer have to have this conversation and it's just a common practice? I'm curious.
This is probably going to sound like an overly simplistic answer to that question, but I think when we don't have to use the word women, right? When we talk about things like the first female such and such, or the first Black so and so, right? Like when we can start there are no more firsts because it's so mainstream that we're all doing everything, right? Then we'll know that we have achieved success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also curious to ask you about image. So many women feel that they have to meet a certain image of the rest of the world, whether they're employed, whether they're married, whether they're a stay-at-home mom. They put this undue pressure on themselves to maintain a certain image. So I'm also curious to ask you, how do we help women manage their expectations when it comes to the images they're trying to portray?
Well, that's such a big question. I wish I had a very good answer for that, because I think that those messages are so universal. They might seem simple, or they might seem inconsequential, but even like every magazine cover is telling us how we're supposed to look and what we're supposed to be doing. We hear social media increases the pressure on us in those ways. We are just constantly hearing from our peers what we should be doing and we're internalizing it. It's really hard. I mean, I think it takes a lot of self-discipline to disconnect from those messages and to really reflect on who we are and what we want to be, how we want to show up in the world. I think it's a worthwhile effort for us to really connect with our core values and ask ourselves if these messages and how we're responding to these pressures are serving us. But I also think it takes a support system. And so not trying to do that alone, but trying to do that in collaboration with other women who are open about being on a similar journey.
Yeah, Kim, I always tell people that everyone's portrait of success is different, isn't it?
Yes.
Absolutely. And tell me, Kim, I'm curious, my final question for you this morning has to do with your own personal or professional legacy and how you want that to be defined.
I would love to work myself out of a job, to be honest with you. I would, my personal legacy in an ideal world would be that people don't experience imposter syndrome because they have all of the tools and resources and mindsets that they need to effectively navigate their workplaces. But given that that's a very high and unlikely goal, I would like my legacy to be that I've helped people to, get through some of the challenges of work in a more effective way.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kim, finally, tell me, if people want to get connected with you, what's the best way they can do that?
Oh, thank you. So my website is yourcareersuccess.com. I also have a podcast of my own called the Imposter Syndrome Files, where I interview people about their experiences with imposter syndrome and try to provide more access to resources to anybody who suffers from it. So thank you very much for having me today.
Yeah, absolutely. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation about career advancement of women and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to thank you for your work in the space and for joining me this morning in conversation. It's most appreciated.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. Thank you for what you do. I think this is a really helpful conversation for many, and I appreciate your hard work.